Mi sentite? Sì? Ok. Allora, buonasera a tutte e a tutti, anche dal professor Stefano Ferrucci, che è l'organizzatore di questo seminario e colui che l'ha reso possibile e che per un concomitante impegno familiare non può essere qui oggi pomeriggio. Quello che mi accingo a presentarvi è l'ultimo incontro di questa sessione dei seminari del martedì. Le precedenti puntate sono disponibili sul canale YouTube di cui gentilmente la professoressa Pischetta sta mettendo il link nella chat. E, l'ultimo incontro, dicevo, prima della pausa estiva, i seminari del martedì, ma poi lo ripeteremo alla fine, riprenderanno il prossimo autunno e presto sarà disponibile anche il calendario degli incontri che poi sarà pubblicato sulla pagina dedicata sempre dalla nostra Eleonora. È un grande onore per noi avere qui oggi pomeriggio ospite il professor Orrels del King's College London. Gli siamo tutti e tutte molto grati per aver accettato il nostro invito, sia a tenere questo seminario, sia a tenere il corso di lingua e letteratura latina per la laurea magistrale in lettere classiche che volge al termine. Le lezioni si concluderanno domani mattina e vado velocemente a presentarlo prima di cedergli la parola. Daniel Orrels si è formato all'Università di Cambridge, ha iniziato la sua carriera presso l'Università di Warwick e dopo una fellowship di 2 anni presso la prestigiosa Humboldt University a Berlino, si è trasferito al King's College di Londra nel 2015 e lì attualmente sta insegnando Classics. Fra il 2017 e il 2021 è stato Head of the Department of Classics ed è in questa veste che io ho avuto l'occasione di conoscerlo, o meglio di entrare in contatto con lui. Eravamo nel pieno della pandemia all'epoca e poi passato al ruolo più prestigioso di Vice Dean della Faculty of Arts and Humanities, sempre a Londra. I suoi interessi principali sono soprattutto la reception della letteratura greca e latina dal Rinascimento al XX secolo, con un'attenzione particolare ai post-colonial studies, ai gender studies e anche ai psychoanalytic studies. Ha all'attivo moltissime pubblicazioni, anche di articoli, contributi, eccetera. Per questo motivo mi limiterò semplicemente a ricordare le sue monografie, partendo da Classical Culture and Modern Masculinity del 2011, Sex, Antiquity and Its Legacy del 2015. Entrambe queste monografie sono state pubblicate dalla Oxford University Press e la sua ultima fatica letteraria è Antiquity in Print, Visualizing Ancient Greece in the 18th Century, pubblicato invece da Bloomsbury. Insieme ad altri importanti studiosi è stato coeditor di African Athena New Agendas. Ricorderete senz'altro il intenso dibattito generato dal libro Black Athena di Afro-Asian Roots of Classical Civilization nell'ormai lontano 1987. Quindi The Mudimbe Reader, che è dedicato a uno dei più importanti filosofi africani, per la precisione il filosofo congolese per l'appunto Mudimbe, e quindi Richard Marsh, Popular Fiction and Literary Culture Between 1819 and 1915, Reading the Fin de siècle, sullo scrittore inglese della novella gotica The Beetle, che era all'epoca più famosa di Dracula, come abbiamo imparato nella lezione dell'altro giorno. E per finire, Freud's Antiquity, Object, Idea, Desire, che è l'argomento di cui ci parlerà oggi con un seminario dal titolo Freudian Archaeology, Why Does It Matter? Many thanks and over to you. Sì, intanto preparavo qua, non mi ero dimenticata di condividere. Allora, dov'è qua?
Condividi.
Ok, chiedo a Eleonora se la condivisione è arrivata.
Perfetto,
Ok,
tutto bene.
grazie, sì, grazie. Rimane da togliere la finestra, la chiudo. Anzi, la nascondo. Ok, così.
Sit here, yeah.
Daniel è più comodo.
Okay. So thank you so much, Philomena, for everything you've done. It's a real honor and privilege to be here in Siena teaching and working with the students and meeting the scholars who I've admired from the other side of our little sea, you know. And I want to, and I hope that, we'll talk about this tomorrow, I hope that our departments between Siena and London can carry on having a relationship, because yeah, the department here is so interesting and full of such interesting people and students. Yeah, it's really exciting for us in London. And today I'm going to be talking to you about Sigmund Freud's interest in classical archaeology. And last year I organized, curated an exhibition at the Freud Museum in London. And this talk comes out of or emerges from that exhibition. So, okay. So archaeology became a discipline and a science in the 19th century. More specifically, archaeology positioned itself as a science. Okay, that's fine. Sorry, I'm not very good with technology. Okay, I'll begin. Okay, archaeology became a discipline and a science in the 19th century. More specifically, archaeology positioned itself as a science of material certainty against the speculations of critical history and textual studies. The authority of biblical and classical texts had been under pressure for over 100 years. What of the Old and New Testaments could be said to be historical? Was there ever anyone called Homer, and did anything like the Trojan War really happen? Biblical archaeology was central to the new scientific status of archaeology. It became a best-selling and much-reported genre, and the institutions associated with it, such as the Palestine Exploration Fund and the Egypt Exploration Society, flourished in Victorian Britain. For as geology had turned the physical nature of the earth into evidence that challenged the Bible's chronology and its authority, so biblical archaeology and its cousin, biblical geography, set out to rediscover the truth of the Bible in the soil of the Holy Land, to provide the facts from the ground, material evidence of the truth of Scripture. Similarly, Heinrich Schliemann's excavations of what he argued was Troy and the Mask of Agamemnon attracted huge attention from both scholars and the wider public. Sigmund Freud was very attracted to this new science and its promise to reveal the past. At one level, the attraction was archaeology's ability to provide physical, material proof for the claims of history. Freud, like many scientists of his own time and ours, was always desperate to find a physiological, neurological basis for his theories of the mind. He repeatedly used archaeology as a privileged metaphor to explain what he was doing, as if archaeology's prestige could be used to authorize his own new science of psychoanalysis. And this is the first extended archaeological analogy Freud produced in print. And this is what Freud wrote in 1896. Imagine a forscher, an explorer, arrives in a little-known region where his interest is aroused by an expanse of ruins, with remains of walls, fragments of columns, and tablets with half-effaced and unreadable inscriptions. He may content himself with inspecting what lies exposed to view, with questioning the inhabitants, perhaps semi-barbaric people, who live in the vicinity, questioning them about what tradition tells them of the history and the meaning of these archaeological remains, and noting down what they tell him, and he may then proceed on his journey. But the Forscher, the explorer, may act differently. He may have brought picks, shovels, and spades with him, and he may set the inhabitants to work with these implements. Together with them, he may start upon the ruins, clear away the rubbish, and beginning from the visible remains, uncover what is buried. If his work is crowned with success, the discoveries are self-explanatory. The ruined walls are part of the ramparts of a palace or a treasure house. The fragments of columns can be filled out into a temple. The numerous inscriptions, which, by good luck, may be bilingual, reveal an alphabet and a language, and when they have been deciphered and translated, they yield or produce undreamed of information about the events of the remote past to commemorate which the monuments were built. Saxa loquuntur. Now, this analogy appears in an 1896 essay called The Etiology of Hysteria. Freud's analogy dovetails closely with his description of the treatment of hysteria. Freud pictures two layers of ruins, an expanse of ruins, he says, that lies exposed to view, and another level that is buried. And by questioning these semi-barbaric inhabitants about what tradition tells them of the place, the explorer archaeologist can unveil what lies buried. Analogously, the psychoanalyst questions his patient, and together they uncover the causes of the latter's hysterical symptoms. And the aim of Freud's essay was to show that there are two etiologies to hysteria. The first that the patient provides, and the second that the psychoanalyst excavates. The first is the patient's self-understanding of their symptoms, and the second, deeper etiology, is the unconscious cause of the symptoms about which the patient herself is not aware. If Freud, the archaeologist explorer's enterprise, is to be crowned with success, the discoveries are self-explanatory, he says. An object that resembles the Rosetta Stone will produce undreamed of information, thanks to these bilingual inscriptions, revealing a hitherto unreadable script. Saxa loquuntur, the rocks speak, as Freud puts it in Latin. But what exactly does Freud mean? How can materiality speak words? In what way is Freud's Latin self-evident? Well, the motif of talking stones had already appeared in Schiller's poem and Die Freunde, Shakespeare's Macbeth, 13th century Legenda Aurea of Jacobus of Voragine, and it goes back to the Bible in the books of Luke and Habakkuk. Freud probably knew the phrase as it was inscribed on the recently built town hall in Vienna. But it also appears in Lucan's epic poem, The Civil War, where Pompeius, Pompeia's son, has sought out a foretelling of the future from the Thessalonian witch, Erichtho. Okay. If, as she says here, if she says you are content to have foreknowledge of the calamities, many easy ways of approaching the truth will open up. The earth, the sky, the abyss, the seas, the plains, and the rocks of Rhodope will speak for us, says Erichtho. She summons a dead man almost back to life, or more accurately, she summons an umbra, in order to explain to Pompeius the fate of his father and his father's army. More precisely still, the source of the truth will be the mouth of a corpse, just dead and still warm. In a neat inversion of the catabasis of Odysseus and Aeneas halfway through their epics, Lucan does not send a hero down to the underworld, but brings one back to life, or almost. He had the face of a man not yet alive, but one of already dying, says Lucan. And the Umbra, who remains unnamed, is asked to foretell the future, saxa loquenta. But Freud's stones speak of the past. Erichtho commands the ghost to speak clearly and not in riddles. She says, "Don't be grudging, I pray. Give events their names and their places, and provide a voice with which fate may speak with me, fata loquantur." But even though the ghost says that dead spirits are waiting for your father and your family, the ghost gives no further information beyond the certainty of death. Lucan's epic defers any sense of closure and repeatedly delays Caesar's victory. Instead, the ghost mysteriously says that, as it says here, it is being asked, quaeritur, at which grave the Nile and at which grave the Tiber will flow, and for the leaders the battle is only about the place of burial. The ghost then provides no sense of resolution, and then says, "For yourself, do not ask about your fate. The Parcae will allow you to know, with me saying nothing." Me reticente. Now, in Book 6 of the Aeneid, the prophetic vision of the future does not speak explicitly about the civil wars which will engulf Rome. In Lucan's Book 6, the centre of an epic which is about the civil war, the prophecy is again reticent about what will happen. The rocks in Lucan, then, do not quite speak the truth. They are not self-evident, which raises the question of the truth-telling status of archaeology for Freud. In this paper today, I want to explore Freud's archaeological metaphor to ask, did archaeology provide Freud with a scientific model and vocabulary? If the rocks didn't simply speak, how did the archaeological analogy play a crucial role in Freud's theorizations about the relationship between the past and the present? In a nutshell, in Nietzsche, how would classical archaeology provide Freud with an opportunity to think about the relationship between materiality and words, between materiality and concepts, between materiality and idealism? Could matter speak the truth, and could truth be turned into physical matter? So let's begin by asking the following question. How do we make sense of the presence of Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres' portrait of Oedipus and the Sphinx hanging at the foot of Sigmund Freud's couch in his Berggasse, Vienna consulting room? This is London now, and this is the portrait. Freud's association, and this is at the end of the couch, the foot of the couch. Freud's, where the patients lie. Freud's association with the Greek myth was secured by his famous formulation of the Oedipus complex. But why Oedipus and the Sphinx, and why this particular representation in his study? The complex involves the significance and resonance of Oedipus's killing his father and sleeping with his mother. Yet this image depicts a different part of Oedipus's story, an episode that takes place between these two events. Here we see Oedipus answering the riddle of the Sphinx, using his famed intellect to defeat the feminine monster who has been tormenting the city of Thebes. Freud answers man to the Sphinx's question, what goes on 4 feet in the morning, 2 at midday, and 3 in the evening. And Oedipus ties his identity to the human characterized by his command of reason. Ingres' distinctive neoclassical image further ties Oedipus to a celebration of human rationality. Using a Greek marble sculpture from the Louvre as his model, Ingres depicts Oedipus in the pose of the thinker. His physiognomy adopts the stooped posture of the intellectual and the body beautiful of Winckelmann's Hellenic ideal. This is an Oedipus who is Greek by virtue of his superior cognitive powers. But unlike the many objects in Freud's study, this is not an ancient relic. It's a contemporary reproduction of an 1808 painting. The image of Oedipus that faced Freud every day was distinctively neoclassical rather than classical. And this mediation speaks to the double nature of Oedipus for Freud. Although the Oedipus depicted in this painting is not the Oedipus of Freud's famous complex, he does embody a distinctively Freudian attitude. So much is evident from the fact that this same image of Oedipus and his encounter with the Sphinx was depicted on a medallion offered to Freud for his 50th birthday. It was accompanied by a quotation from Sophocles' play. On the right-hand side here, it says in Greek, "He who knew the riddle of the Sphinx and was a man most mighty," which comes right at the end of Sophocles' tragedy by the chorus. For Freud, it was psychoanalysis that sought to solve the riddle of the unconscious, while the Oedipus who emerges from Freud's complex is a man characterized by his ignorance. Oedipus remains for Freud a figure of science. Oedipus both remains a figure of traditional science and signposts the appearance of a new science characterized by self-examination. In reaching to the classical figure of Oedipus, for all the strangeness and weirdness, the idiosyncrasy of his interpretation, Freud reaches for a classical ideal. We can see why Freud purchased this red figure Hydria, showing a nude, idealized figure of Oedipus with the Sphinx. So that's in London today. Yet the status of antiquity as an ideal associated with rationality was a particular worry and preoccupation for Freud. In 1936, some 30 years after his first discussion of Oedipus in the interpretation of dreams, Freud would pen an open letter to a French writer, which became known as his essay called On a Disturbance of Memory on the Acropolis. Now, in this, here's the Acropolis with some sheep. Now, in the letter, Freud recounts how he and his brother, Alexander, visited the Acropolis on the 4th of September 1904. So Freud visits the Acropolis in 1904, and he writes this letter, this open letter, which he publishes in 1936. Now, Alexander and Sigmund had been together in Italy, and they had not intended to go to Athens, but when their plans to visit Corfu were cancelled, they found themselves on a boat from Trieste to the city of Athens. Now, Freud's visit to Athens places him within a lineage or a line of intellectuals who performed this Philhellenic pilgrimage. It's a tradition which all too often is marked by a sense of the uncanny, the unheimlich. The scholar Ernest Renan's prayer on the Acropolis, for Renan, the classical site becomes the scene for a profound crisis of identity. And other contemporary writers like Hugo von Hofmannsthal and Virginia Woolf struggle to reconcile the Greece of their imagination with the complex practicalities of travel in modern Greece. And at the heart, or the crux, of Freud's encounter is an experience of what Freud calls a derealization. And so this is what Freud writes. When finally, on the afternoon of our arrival, I stood on the Acropolis and cast my eyes around upon the landscape, and a surprising thought suddenly entered my mind. So all this really does exist, just as we learnt at school. To describe the situation more accurately, the person who gave expression to the remark was divided, far more sharply than was usually noticeable, from another person who took cognizance of the remark. and both were astonished, though not by the same thing. The first behaved as though he were obliged, under the impact of an unequivocal observation, to believe in something the reality of which had hitherto seemed doubtful. If I may make a slight exaggeration, it was as if someone walking beside Loch Ness in Scotland suddenly caught sight of the form of the famous monster upon the shore and found himself driven to the admission, so it really does exist, the sea serpent we've never believed in. But the second person in my head was justifiably astonished, because he had been unaware that the real existence of Athens, the Acropolis, and the landscape around it had ever been objects of doubt. What he had been expecting was rather some expression of delight or admiration. So, Freud recollects his experience on the Acropolis as a split reaction, as if he were two people, one who couldn't believe that the Acropolis was real, and the other who is now amazed that the reality of the Acropolis was ever in doubt, and is now wondering why he isn't delighted. The experience of standing on the Acropolis returns Freud to the scene of his own childhood. Freud's identification with Athens is mediated through the classroom. He says, I learnt about this at school. What Freud calls derealization is a self-conscious recalibration of the discourse of Philhellenism. As Stathis Gougoris has written, Freud's arrival at this site signals the impossible confrontation between the discourse of the Hellenic ideal, internalized as part of the process of Bildung, German education, and its visual presentation as the real. For Freud, the encounter with the real Acropolis calls into crisis the Philhellenic underpinnings or support of his own education. Freud seems to be suggesting that the education he received only provided him with a facade of Hellenism, which did not manage to penetrate into his unconscious. He continues, "It would be possible to maintain that it was true that when I was a schoolboy, I had thought I was convinced of the historical reality of the city of Athens and its history, but that the occurrence of this idea on the Acropolis had precisely shown that in my unconscious I had not believed in it, and that it was only now acquiring a conviction that reached down in the unconscious." The effect of Athens on Freud's unconscious serves merely to call its existence into doubt. But despite the initial pull of this explanation, Freud will reject it, and he says, "It is not true that in my school days I ever doubted the real existence of Athens. Rather, I only doubted whether I should ever see Athens. It seemed to me beyond the realms of possibility that I should travel so far, that I should go such a long way. This was linked up with the limitations and poverty of our conditions of life in my youth. My longing to travel was no doubt also the expression of a wish to escape from that pressure, like the force which drives so many adolescent children to run away from home. I had long seen clearly that a great part of the pleasure of travel lies in the fulfillment of these early wishes, that it is rooted, that is, in dissatisfaction with home and family. So it's not so much his Bildung, on Freud's own account, which was called into question by his experiences on the Acropolis, but rather his home and family. It's hardly surprising to find Freud return to the scene of the family. For Freud, the childhood of humanity is a metonym of his own childhood. And he says, and here we come upon the solution of the little problem of which it was already, but here we come upon the solution of the little problem of why it was that already at Trieste we interfered with our enjoyment of the voyage to Athens. It must be a sense of guilt was attached to the satisfaction in having gone such a long way. There was something about it that was wrong, that from earliest times had been forbidden. It was something to do with a child's criticism of his father, with the undervaluation which took the place of the overvaluation of earlier childhood. It seems as though the essence of success was to have gone further than one's father, as though to excel one's father was still something forbidden. So Freud's German puns on the words weiter and Vater. But just at the moment that Freud seems to turn the primal scene of European identity into an Oedipal encounter at the Freud family's own crossroads, he decides to place this familial drama back into a larger cultural context. And he says the following: as an addition to this generally valid motive, there was about sort of going beyond the father and feeling guilt, okay? In addition to this generally valid motive, there was a special factor present in our particular case. The very theme of Athens and the Acropolis in itself contained evidence of the son's superiority. Our father had been in business. He had had no secondary education, and Athens could have not meant much to him. Thus, what interfered with our enjoyment of the journey to Athens was a feeling of filial piety. Given the association of Greece and Germany with a certain construction of Wissenschaft, Freud's scientific success is a symptom of his Hellenization and his abandonment of his Judaism. Consequently, writes Gouguris, this feeling of piety engenders a disturbance of pleasure, which is indeed the source of the derealization, as the Hebraic father returns to punish the Hellenized son. We witness Freud transform his autobiographical Oedipal scenario into a questioning of the ontological status of antiquity, where for many scholars the findings of archaeology have been drawn upon to support the actual basis of the ideal of idealized antiquity. For Freud, in contrast, the real remains of Athens cause him to question his investment in the ideal, which was not destined to be his own. It might be tempting to see in Freud's journey from Oedipus to the Acropolis a reflection of his changing characterization of psychoanalysis from the so-called cathartic method to one structured around the archaeological metaphor. In appropriating a term that Aristotle made famous in his analysis of the effects of tragedy, Freud seemed to be associating psychoanalysis with a literary genre whose prestige was celebrated in the 19th century. To borrow a term from the philosopher Simon Critchley, Freud shared the Sophocles complex of his age. Can we therefore detect a shift in his investment in antiquity from a textual model to one later based in material culture? And might this transferal hint at the confrontation of an idealized conception with a history from below? The chronology of Freud's thinking, however, does not fit such a neat pattern. The archaeological metaphor frames his writings from early on, as we've seen with Hysteria, to Moses and monotheism at the end of the 1930s. Similarly, the slow development of the Oedipus complex and its persistence in his thought speaks to the resilience of tragic metaphors in his writing. Moreover, as this Athens letter makes clear, the material remains of antiquity are a reminder to Freud of the idealized conception of antiquity in his childhood, while at the same time they make evident the tragic impossibility of an objective reconstruction of the past. In fact, despite the textual origins of catharsis, Freud drew on the interpretation of the philologist Jakob Bernays, actually his wife's uncle. Bernays, he understood the purification offered by tragedy as a form of physical purgation. Freud would conceptualize catharsis as the discharge of psychic energy that is pent up. Catharsis thus references a Philhellenic principle, but also supports a materialist paradigm. Now, in his important essay of 1989, the art historian Donald Cuspit wrote that to understand the archaeological metaphor is to understand the heart and the detail of psychoanalytic thinking. Cuspit's essay was published in the collection Sigmund Freud and Art, his personal collection of antiquities, in 1989. And pioneering in many ways, this book marked a very significant moment in the understanding of Freud. It centralized the connection between his personal collection of antiquities and the conceptual apparatus at the heart of his thought. Since its publication in 1989, a huge amount has been written about the history of archaeology and its relation to the disciplines of philology, theology, and critical history. And our sense of Freud as a student of antiquity has changed and deepened. For Cuspit, Freud's appeal to archaeology can be regarded as an effort to ingratiate psychoanalysis with society, to win its approval and trust, to gain an influential place for psychoanalysis, even to have some of the heroic quality of archaeology be associated with psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis would gain both popular appeal and scientific respectability from this association. And yet, what this example of Athens shows is that Freud's investment in the remains of antiquity was not without ambivalence. Was Freud's assimilation into Wissenschaft a price worth paying? Or did his status as a Jew make him question the cultural valuation of classical antiquity by honing his hermeneutics of suspicion? Now, the famous Rome analogy from Civilization and its Discontents may at first seem to fit Cuspit's description. By giving the psyche a material basis, Freud would appear to bolster the scientific respectability of psychoanalysis with a comparison with archaeology. So let's look at this analogy from 1930. Since we overcame the error of supposing that the forgetting we are familiar with signified a destruction of the memory trace, that is, its annihilation, we have been inclined to take the opposite view, that in mental life, nothing which has been formed can perish, that everything is somehow preserved, and that in suitable circumstances, it can be brought to light. So everything in the psyche is preserved for Freud. It's just hidden, repressed in the unconscious. Nothing really is forgotten. Let us grasp, he says, what this assumption involves by taking an analogy from another field. We will choose as an example the history of the eternal city. Now let us, by flight of imagination, suppose that Rome is not a human habitation, but a psychical entity with a long and copious past. An entity, that is to say, in which nothing that has once come into existence will have passed away, and all earlier phases of development continue to exist alongside the latest one. This would mean that in Rome, the palaces of the Caesars and the Septizonium of Septimus Severus would still be rising to their old height on the Palatine, and the castle of San Angelo would still carry on its battlements the beautiful statues which graced it until the siege of the Goths, and so on and on. But almost as interesting as this elaborate and visually arresting parallel which Freud creates is its seemingly immediate denial and disavowal. For at the end of this analogy, Freud interrupts himself, and then he says, "There is clearly no point in spinning our fantasy any further, for it leads to things that are unimaginable and even absurd." Freud, first of all, has anxieties about the possibility of mapping historical sequence onto a spatial plane. But he then worries about the boldness of creating an equivalence between a psychical entity and such an explicitly historical and cultural construct. He says that the question may be raised why we chose precisely the past of a city to compare the past of a mind. For Freud, the difficulty of the analogy, as he says, comes from the demolitions and replacement of buildings which occur in the course of even the most peaceful development of a city, which can be likened to trauma and inflammation of brain tissues. So, as it says here, Freud concludes, we bow to this objection, and we abandon our attempt to draw a striking comparison, contrast, and we will turn instead to what is, after all, a more closely related object of comparison, the body of an animal and a human being. So Freud retreats into biology, and that might suggest his re-entrenchment into positivism. But this specific failure of the archaeological analogy seems to lead in a different direction. Far from securing a secure basis for the real, the archaeological metaphor leads into the opposite direction. The processes of destruction and renovation which characterize the life of the city are too unstable an analogy for Freud's image of the unconscious which never forgets. Ultimately, Rome speaks to the need to move beyond empirical science as a model for both archaeology and psychoanalysis. What is at stake here is less a question of the respectability of science, rather a recognition of how the encounter between psychoanalysis and archaeology changes both. The insights of psychoanalysis remind us that archaeological discovery is driven by the desire of the archaeologist, and archaeology reminds the analyst, the psychoanalyst, of the losses as well as of the remainders of the past. In fact, archaeology and critical history were appealing to Freud as much for their ability to problematize as to offer propriety and status. Now, one of the insights of Cuspit was to link Freud's discussion of the archaeological metaphor in his works to the archaeological objects that Freud collected in his lifetime. And Freud was an obsessive collector of antiquities, and he had over 3,000 objects in his personal collections. His consulting rooms in Vienna and London were populated with these antiquities. They crowded his desk and perched over his famous couch. Freud frequently used the objects in his collection to explain his theories of the mind to his patients. The American writer Hilda Doolittle, one of his patients, said that these objects helped Freud to stabilize the effervescent thought that was continually at risk of dissipation. Now, when Freud was forced to leave Nazi-occupied Vienna in 1938, he fled to London and went to great lengths to ensure that the collection of antiquities was able to follow him. And now in Maresfield Gardens in Hampstead, an extremely expensive suburb in North London, the Freud Museum had preserved the exact arrangement and positioning of the collection in Freud's consulting room. You can see here. You can see the desk there, right, and the chair. Okay. These objects and their relationship to Freud's thought were the subject of the exhibition I co-curated last year in the Freud Museum. And yet, despite Hilda Doolittle's idea that Freud's objects could stabilize the effervescent thought, Freud's Rome analogy we've just been reading was written by Freud after he'd read Rodolfo Lanciani's La Distruzione di Roma Antica, which came out in the 1890s and was published in an English translation in 1899, and that was the edition that Freud read. Lanciani, famously, was a leading scholar of Roman archaeology in the 19th century. Several of his books were translated into English, and they had a very wide readership on both sides of the Atlantic. Books like The Destruction of Rome are filled with evocative photographs and passages which sum up the disappearance of Roman antiquity. This is a good example here of Lanciani's imagery. It shows a broken fragment of a statue suspended between reconstruction and further decay. In his analogy, we had read Freud mentioning the Septizonium. And Lanciani writes that archaeologists are still discussing what the name means and what was the real nature of the edifice. The jumble of ruins in Rome provided huge challenges, not just for the Roman tourist, but also for the professional archaeologist in the late 19th century. Even surviving buildings threw up more questions than answers. Lanciani calls the Pantheon the Sphinx of the Campus Martius, in its refusal to answer the archaeologist's analysis. And he refers to the veil of mystery in which the monument was shrouded. In spite of its preservation, he says, it remains inexplicable from many points of view. In his Destruction of Rome, Lanciani posed the question, who destroyed Rome? He answered that it wasn't the invading hordes and barbarians, but rather the Romans themselves who continuously demolished and recycled their built environment. As Mary Jacobus writes, Lanciani's main contention that from earliest times the Romans themselves were the principal destroyers of their city puts a question mark over any attempt to reconstruct the past, whether urban or psychic. Rome for Lanciani becomes a site for contemplating the continuously changing and shifting nature of the past. In Civilization and Its Discontents, where he wrote the Rome analogy, Freud would argue that civilization is only possible because we repress and forget our desires in the unconscious. We forget our past wishes. And yet there is something inherently destructive about our desires, which return from the repressed to wreak havoc upon us. Writing after World War I, the death of his daughter Sophie, the diagnosis of jaw cancer, Freud turned to archaeology not to stabilize the past, but both to question its accessibility and to mark the eruption of dark, archaic pasts into the so-called civilized present. Roman archaeology showed Freud that we destroy our pasts and that those pasts also uncontrollably return to undo us. His archaeological analogy ended up emphasizing the complexity of the relationship between past and present. Now, Freud started collecting immediately after the death of his father, at exactly the time he was working on his first major work of psychoanalysis, The Interpretation of Dreams. Although there are occasional casual references to his collection in his published work, one notable example is the case study of the Rat Man, where Freud points to the objects on his desk to explain the differences between the conscious and the unconscious mind. But Freud never explored his own compulsion, his own obsession to collect in his published works. So although Freud analyzes the psychological compulsions of the archaeologist in his interpretation of Wilhelm's novel Gradiva, he never turned his own eye back upon himself. So let's explore then how Freud's physical collection of antiquities can provide a new perspective on his thought, and conversely, how his theories give new dimensions to the objects with which he surrounded himself. So let's focus on an example. This is in Freud's collection in London. It's a well-preserved wine jug. As you can see, it has a molded pouring spout and is decorated with black figures of two fighting warriors. It may not be the most dramatic of ceramics, but there are two things worth mentioning. Freud's antiquities are interestingly diverse in their provenance. The single culture most represented is Egypt, followed by Greek and Roman objects, but Freud also collected antiquities from Mesopotamia, India, China, and even Aztec and Incan art. Here are some examples. This is Hebraic antiquity, India. Okay, back to Etruria. So although this jug may look like it's Greek or Roman, to a non-specialist general public outside of this room, it's of course Etruscan. I don't need to remind anyone here the Etruscans, the importance of the Etruscans in the ancient world, who contributed much to the development of early Roman civilization, and yet their language died out and is not fully understood today. We retain a huge number of Etruscan artifacts, but the challenges of understanding their language makes them mysterious to us in ways that the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Romans are not. And the second thing that makes this wine jug interesting is that it stands in the place of another Etruscan artifact from Freud's collection, but an object that we now cannot see. And that other object was an Etruscan cinerary urn, something to put cremated ashes into. Now, Freud had once possessed this other urn, but he'd given it away. And that's a reminder that Freud's collection was a dynamic thing when he was still alive. He often picked up new acquisitions on his journey to Italy, or was given them by friends, and he presented his objects to colleagues and friends throughout his life. The circulation of these objects in Freud's orbit tells us much as their static attributes. We shouldn't just look at these objects. We shouldn't just look at objects in any collection. We should trace the interesting webs of desire that the collector weaves through his collection, a desire no single piece can fully satisfy. But I want to offer an analogy with this Etruscan jug, something that Freud loved to do. Think of this vessel, its miraculous physical preservation through time. In a way, it guarantees that the ancient world really did exist. Now think of the lost civilization to which it belongs, the gatherings of friends and family that might have used it, and the silence that now surrounds it in the utter absence of the Etruscan language. When Freud sat down to write The Interpretation of Dreams in 1899, he was hoping to recover a lost language, the lost language of dreams, which he argued do have meaning. But we must learn or relearn this language of dreams and come to understand the complicated process by which dreams are formed. Inevitably, dreams lead to the unconscious in Freud's view, and they can only be understood indirectly through their effects. The dreams we experience are the subject of a kind of censorship, a process of condensation and displacement that give the dream its unheimlich, its uncanny form. Therefore, when looking at this wine jug, we should think of that other urn, the one that we cannot see. This other urn appears in the interpretation of dreams at a really important moment in chapter 3. Freud states his theory that dreams represent the fulfillment of a wish, and he even says he can produce a certain kind of dream, experimentally as it were. Whenever he eats salty food at night, his thirst will wake him up, but a dream precedes his waking. Namely, he dreams that he is drinking. He has a real bodily desire, a thirst for water, and the dream fulfills the wish to preserve the sleeping state. But then Freud talks about a modification of this dream, where he dreams his wife was giving him a drink out of that cinerary urn that he had brought back to Italy and that he's given away. In fulfilling his wish, the dream has his wife wait upon him. He freely admits that the dream is self-centered. His wife is like a waitress. But then the specific detail of the Etruscan urn was probably another wish fulfillment mixed into the dream. He says, I was sorry that the vase was no longer in my possession. So the dream brings together two different desires into one dream scenario. Freud manages in this dream to weave together a very straightforward wish fulfillment of thirst with a more subtle, more personal wish in order to introduce the most fundamental concept in his book. So this is the moment in the book which he argues that dreams are a fulfillment of a wish, okay? And he uses this Etruscan analogy to introduce this concept. And so this dream of his to put his desire for archaeological artifacts on a par with something as basic as thirst is a discussion which gives us a disturbing image of his wife Martha giving him a drink from a funerary urn. He remarks in the dream that he has the sensation of tasting the saltiness of the ashes. It's a repugnant idea. Imagine drinking dead Etruscans. Is this dream also relating some kind of hostility on the part of Martha, that she is literally giving him the taste of death? In Freud's view, the symbolism of dreams are multivalent, polyphonic, so much so that we typically face the situation of both and rather than either or in our unconscious. To enter the dream world is to engage with the full complexity of human desire, our ambivalence even towards those we love the most, our lingering wishes that continue to haunt us, the way the missing Etruscan vase still bothered Freud at some level. Now, from the beginning of Freud's book, he compared the dream world to an underworld journey by quoting a line from Juno in Virgil's Aeneid on the title page, Flectere sinequir superos acoronta movebo. While that may sound a bit grandiose, the move to writing about dreams was a pivotal moment in Freud's development of psychoanalysis. Up to this point, Freud was hoping to make breakthroughs on the clinical front in the treatment of psychoneuroses. But with dreams, Freud was writing about an experience that everyone has on a nightly basis. And this is the first major work to inaugurate a project of extended application of his insights well beyond the world of the clinic. In fact, if we look at the books he wrote between 1899 and 1913, we can see that he is spreading his focus more broadly into all areas of culture and human life. He writes a book called The Psychopathology of Everyday Life, Jokes and their relation to the unconscious, Dreams and Delusions in Jensen's Gradiva, Leonardo da Vinci and a memory of his childhood, and finally Totem and Taboo in 1913. These are all studies that move well beyond the specialist circles of medical science, and they show Freud's conviction that psychoanalysis is a bold new theory of the mind with very wide general applications. It's a period of restless energy, creativity for Freud, and coincides with his gathering following the beginnings of a movement. But ancient culture both consoles and confounds Freud in his dream book. Freud introduces the book by simultaneously displaying his knowledge of the ancient past and its impact on his thinking, but he also differentiates his own methods from the old dream books in antiquity. These old dream books, he says, offered useful intuitions and observations. They're mostly about foretelling the future, prophecy, but not clearly providing the true method of interpretation he is after. Okay, he worries about his identification with ancient dream interpreters. So we find Freud instead looking to the modern study of antiquity, to alte Wissenschaft, to assure his reader that his new science of interpretation can be trusted. In a passage where he is discussing the ambiguity of dreams, he freely admits that any dream element can be ambiguous. It is doubtful whether a dream should be taken in a positive or a negative sense. It is doubtful whether a dream should be understood historically. Should it be understood symbolically? Should we depend on the wording in the dream? And then, so having discussed all this complexity in dream interpretation, he then asserts, yet in spite of all this ambiguity, it is fair to say that the productions of the dream work, which, it must be remembered, are not made with the intention of being understood, they're repressed, they present no greater difficulties to their translators like me than do the ancient hieroglyphic scripts to those who seek to read them. So here Freud refers his analogy to the decipherment of ancient languages to reassure us that the ambiguity is not fatal to understanding. It's just indicative of the complexity of the human mind and its self-censorship. By invoking the decipherment of the hieroglyphs, Freud was alluding to one of the crowning achievements of 19th century Altertumswissenschaft. in the hope of associating psychoanalysis with scientific glamour. But if we remember the Etruscan wine jug, we are reminded that there are mysteries from antiquity, such as the Etruscan language, which remain beyond the grasp of science. So while the comparison of psychoanalysis to the Wissenschaften of antiquity could be grounding and important for Freud's new science, it did not offer unproblematic models for the acquisition of knowledge. And if, as we saw with the Rome analogy, the study of the past in archaeology in particular did not offer a secure model for the scientific respectability of psychoanalysis, it certainly reminded the patient of the significance of the past in the life of the mind. As Cuspit writes, to return to Cuspit, archaeology is not simply a means to end amnesia, but an assertion that there is none. The past lives all around us. It's sedimented in the present. We are surrounded by it, but in the symbolic form of memory. More precisely, we live memories. The archaeological metaphor is not a guarantee for the recoverability of the unconscious. Rather, it calls into question the boundaries between the past and the present. Like Freud's Rome, the mind holds past and present in suspension, with secure chronology becoming an illusion. In Freud's consulting room, we see modernity saturated with the presence of the past. Surrounded by his antiquities, Freud was reminded of the inescapability and the pull of the collective past, that is, of the fact that we all exist in an already sedimented life. For Freud, the site of the Acropolis, connected as it was with the origins of Western identity, brings him back to his own beginnings. And yet what Freud actually experienced on the Acropolis was very much a deliberate reconstruction of a classical identity, which involved the clearing away of intervening civilizations. The archaeological site had witnessed countless reincarnations since the classical era: Roman temple, Byzantine church, Ottoman garrison, and later mosque. The Acropolis that Freud witnessed in 1904 was a neoclassical simulacrum. And so then, if we return to Anger's neoclassical Oedipus, who looked back at Freud from the foot of the couch, we return also to this question of sedimentation. Anger's painting juxtaposes an idealized image of man, a man who discovers himself in his intellectual triumph over the Sphinx, with another more archaeological, materialist representation of the human. Below Oedipus's famous foot, from which his name obviously derives, is another foot, the dismembered foot of one of the Sphinx's victims. And next to the limb lies a skull, symbol of man's mortality and his earthly transience. Freud realized that beneath the classical representation of Oedipus lay an archaeology of man yet to be fully exhumed. The practice of archaeology, as we've been exploring today, was a complex relationship. The practice of archaeology, as we've been exploring today, had a complex relationship with the idealization of antiquity. Classics is about matter, but it seeks to go beyond matter to the idea, saxa loquuntur. And yet Freud also sought to turn his ideas back into physical matter. The question of the materiality of truth and the truth of materiality could not be examined for Freud without turning to classical archaeology. Thank you very much.
We can interrupt. Finish sharing. Okay. So thank you so much, Daniel, for such a new perspective on this fascinating subject about maybe a further relationship between the past and the present. If you have any questions, the floor is open here and online. Okay. Manuela.
Yes, thank you very much, Filomena, for organizing this very, very interesting seminar. Thank you, Dawn. That was That was very, very interesting. It was very fascinating. I have a couple of points. Well, in the first place, so would you say that the use of that Freud makes of the ancient world is to bestow respectability and authoritativeness in a certain way on this new science that he was building? And I think that in this respect, it's very interesting to look at the Vienna of that period, of Freud's period, because everything inside the Ringstrasse is neoclassic. And so that's very interesting, because what is playing with are actually symbols and a cultural discourse that the Vienna of his peers of that period is really saturated with. So what he's doing, and it's interesting what you were referring on his own Jewish past and symbols that he really ignores, which is quite interesting, isn't it? Because actually it's a very, very rich tradition, but it turns to a set of symbols that exactly gives him what he's looking after. This sense of this, I don't know how to say that, this panache, this veneer of something which is dignified and respected, and it really works. So this the first thing, and I would like to try and connect this point with your first quotation is from the etiology of hysteria, 1896, which is very interesting because it makes me think of the book by Jeffrey Moussaieff-Masson, the Assault on Truth, where he speaks about the suppression, Freud's moving away from the seduction theory, which is exactly 1896, is the essay you quoted, where he actually he says that behind hysteria there's a fact, bit like the archaeological metaphor of something that really did exist. There's a sexual trauma and so on and so forth. Then when he presents this to his peers, it is really sneered at. So it doesn't find this respectability, this looking for, and then so the Masson thesis about saying, okay, that was not a fact, that was actually a fantasy. So I don't know, I would like to hear a little bit about this part of Freud, again, out of respectability, moving away from a theory, dealing with the fact, and say no, that's a fantasy, and it turns to the Oedipus myth and so on and so forth. So thank you very much.
No, thank you so much, Manuela. That's a really rich pair of questions. So firstly, about Vienna, it's really interesting. You're exactly correct to say that the Ringstrasse was, Vienna was rebuilt at the end of the 19th century. It was being turned into this modern imperial capital, and it's intensely neoclassical. And again, the architecture of Vienna, like several European capitals being rebuilt in the 19th century, is about trying to cement together an intangible idealism with a kind of reality, with a concrete reality, and his at the time of him, at the time, Vienna was an interesting, well, at the time of it, when he was writing as a Jew living in Vienna at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, it was both the best and sort of the beginning of the worst of times, because Jews became much more assimilated in Viennese life. He kind of enjoyed a kind of bourgeois identity, unlike ever before in Vienna. But at the end of the 19th century, a very anti-Semitic mayor was elected and occupied. You know, his offices were in the town hall, where this inscription "Saxa Lacunta" was on the facade of that building. So the built environment of Vienna is really important. And there's a book, I can't remember what it's called now, but I can be in touch with you. There's a very good book written about Freud's interest in the built environment of Vienna, actually. So I can send you we can email each other. I can recommend that to you. In terms about the seduction theory, so just for to keep everyone up to date in the room as well. So Freud's ideas took a shift at the end of the 19th century. So most psychologists at the end of the 19th century, when they were treating their patients, were interested in excavating the history of their patients' lives, and they were invested in finding or locating an origin, a moment, a traumatic moment that produces a set of symptoms that, you know, that the hysteric patient lives with. Okay. Now, Freud argued in his early writings that hysteria and other psychological illnesses were the product of sexual abuse by parents or carers when a child was very young. And that sort of idea was reflected in lots of psychological writing at the end in the 19th century, okay, that there was actual event that happened that produces a set of symptoms. But then, as you're saying, Manuela, this paper, The Etiology of Hysteria, is the beginning of him changing his ideas, and he moves away from that, and he argues for a very different understanding of the history of one's biography. And he starts arguing that actually what happens in very early childhood is not necessarily actual traumatic events, but what actually happens is a psychodrama in the head of the child, okay? And so that the child, you know, with two parents or two carers, goes through this kind of drama of Oedipus. You know, it has this kind of initial relationship with one carer, the mother, and then it discovers there's another person involved, and you know, and this kind of drama gets played out in the head of the child. Okay, and so it's very interesting, and with the students in tomorrow's class, we'll explore this more. But Freud moves from a kind of positivistic understanding of history, a kind of a desire to be able to excavate real events in the past, and then he moves to a sense of the origins of things are mythical at the beginning. You know, the origins of our identity, well, the beginnings of our identity was a drama that's being played out in our heads. And that reflects his reading of classical scholarship as well. He was reading Niebuhr's Römische Geschichte, right? And in the Römische Geschichte, he actually quotes a lot of this from his book about Leonardo da Vinci. He quotes from Niebuhr, who had argued earlier in the 19th century that we can't trust the early books of Livy, we can't trust the early books, we can't trust the kind of prehistory, the records of prehistory. Those records of prehistory are just our modern projections back in time, you know, and that, you know, all we can get from the earliest point in time are kind of our modern projections and our ideas about what actually happened, kind of thing. So Freud's kind of shifting and changing understanding of how to write a history of the self, and as you will know, Manuela, people will know in this room, Freud would have a huge impact on how we write biography and how we conceptualize autobiography. You know, he's moving, you know, from a kind of moment in the 19th century of kind of positivism and a belief that you can find the event, you know, you can find the trauma, to a kind of sense of, you know, he's moving from history to myth, you know, he's kind of changing discourse, you know. So yeah, and so yeah, so I don't know if you want to say anything in reply to that, but yeah.
No, thank you very much. It was a very, yeah, illuminating from a certain viewpoint. However, I still think that there's something about his wish to comply with the discourse of his peers. So I think that's part of you know, he's moving away from the seduction theory.
Yeah.
It's partly, of course, it's complex, but I think there's something that has to do with his you know, desire to be accepted, and you know, the reaction, you know, the cold reaction that, you know, met his first theory. I think
yes, that's what you mean.
a part that that would sit well with this, you know, the reconstruction you gave about, you know, this search for respectability and being accepted and playing with, you know, symbols that there were you know, major symbols, and yeah.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely.
Thank you very much.
You know, you're absolutely right that this first theory of the seduction theory really was not received very well, and you know, this move to a kind of psychodramatic kind of mythical, you know, the myth being played out in our heads, you know, that is, you know, that's his attempt to gain respectability, and I think you already mentioned, Manuela, that unfortunately, you know, the Oedipus complex, you know, didn't, you know, it both does and doesn't gain respectability, and it has this, you know, has its own very complicated reception. So yeah, the etiology of hysteria was called a scientific fairy tale by a lot of people in the community. So, you know, I mean, Freud is, you know, he's very self-conscious about the relationship between fictionalizing and reality, you know, myth and truth. You know, he's playing with these games very, very self-consciously. So yeah, thank you, Manuela. That's really, really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manuela. Any other comments? No? So just a personal note. When I was a child, I was really intrigued by Freud, I think, like many other girls and boys. So I kept reading and reading about him, his life, and I also dreamed of becoming a psychoanalyst. Fortunately, or maybe not, I changed my mind about that. But I once happened to read that when Freud died, and you know, he had a very tragic death because he was very ill because of the jaw cancer you mentioned earlier. His ashes were put in a Greek vase, and now after your lecture, I find this coincidence very moving. And I'm also wondering if it's just a coincidence or it was on purpose.
It was definitely on purpose. Yeah, he did. I'm pretty sure he requested this, or at least his family thought this was totally suitable.
I didn't know about his obsession for ancient objects. That's totally new to me.
Yeah, and when I mean, I would really recommend, if you ever go to London, I mean, the Freud Museum is not in a, sorry, guys. If you go to London, I'd really recommend visiting the Freud Museum because, you know, it's not part of the tourist trail. You know, you take the tube to Hampstead in North London, and Hampstead was a place where artists and academics and, you know, people lived, you know. Now London,
wealthy.
but now London is a bit more expensive, you know. And so when Freud moved there in 1938, he bought the house for about £200,000, which was a lot of money. And then he was one of the most famous people on the planet in 1938. But nowadays, those houses in this area, they're about 10, 15, 20 million. You know, you have people building basements with swimming pools, and they have car parks underneath the houses and stuff like that. But it's a really, really very beautiful kind of Edwardian, it's the epitome of an Edwardian E.M. Forster English suburb, right? Kind of roses in the garden, you know. And when you open the door and go into the house, you step back in time and you step back into fin de siècle Vienna and all this dark, wonderful dark furniture. The ground floor is reproduced like in Vienna, like I showed you, the couch and the library, the objects, you know. And so the house itself is a bit like the unconscious, you know. It's, you know, you're in London, you go back into time, you go back into a hidden space, you know, inside the house. There's interesting contrast between outside and inside, and you know, they're clearly playing with that idea, the curators. So yeah, I'd really recommend, you know, if when you find yourself next in London, just get the tube. Yeah, just go, you know, it's not very far. Hampstead is very close. Hampstead is a village in the centre of London. This is why it's so expensive, because it's like living in a village, but 10 minutes from, you know, everything, you know. So, but you can just get the tube, 10 minutes on the tube. And yeah, it's really fun to visit, actually. But yeah, it's a sense of stepping back into 19th century Vienna, and it's all this lots of kind of Jewish objects as well. Yeah, it's really fun. So.
Qui, Luca, do you have any questions?
Thank you.
We can't hear you. Okay.
No, I don't have any questions. Just thank you, Daniel, for a fascinating lecture. You cannot hear me.
Okay.
Oh, they're still there.
Volevo solo alzare il volume. So I was saying a quick final thought.
I think the thunder is an omen.
So if nobody has anything else to add.
Thank you for tolerating my English as well.
No, your English is brilliant and very slow and clear. So thank you so much for helping us in attending your lesson. So our sincere thanks to Daniel.
And thank you.
Diamo appuntamento, anzi, prima ringraziamo Eleonora e Alessandro per il loro supporto informatico e diamo appuntamento al prossimo ciclo, la prossima sessione dei seminari del martedì a ottobre del 2024.
Chiudi tu, Alessandro, faccio io.
Ah, se vuoi Leonora fai pure tu, visto che sei connesso e tutto, fai pure te. Grazie.
Ok, perfetto.
Grazie,
Ciao,
grazie.
grazie a tutti.
Arrivederci, ciao.
Arrivederci.
No, Manuela.
Oh, wait a minute.
She's our Greek teacher.
Oh,
She's
is she?
teaching,
Oh, wonderful. Okay. Ah.